Hello and greetings, book lovers everywhere, and welcome to E-Train Talks. I'm E-Train, and today this is a very special interview, one that's really close to my heart, but it's also an important interview. I'm here virtually with two author friends of mine, Torrey Maldonado and Chris Barron. Round of applause for them, everybody. I mean, come on, these authors are revolutionary. Their stories are fantastic. They're amazing people, and they're the writers of award-winning middle grade stories. Torrey's book Hands is a 2024 global read aloud pick. I've seen pictures of kids in Sweden all around the world reading his books this year, which is really exciting to see. And also, I mean, we can't discredit Chris Barron. Chris Barron's book, The Magical and Perfect, was a Sidney Taylor notable book. And, I mean, this interview is not about awards by any means. This interview is about the topic, a theme that's discussed heavily in much of Chris and Torrey's novels. This interview is about toxic masculinity, how to combat it, and why it's important to normalize healthy masculinity in children's books and in our own households. So we're going to dissect what this term means and just have some important and, wise conversations. I'm not biased, but I know that we're all very wise. So, yeah, it's a heavy but impactful and meaningful talking point, and I'm thrilled to have the chance to dive in with two esteemed writers. Yeah, you guys are esteemed. So just thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Great to be with you both.
it's great to be with
And,
you.
and thank you. I can't think of two other persons that I want to be in conversation with about this topic more than both of you.
Thank you. So, in preparing for our talk, I looked up toxic masculinity, the term, and discovered that it was really first introduced in the 1980s. I mean, it's been around for forever, but the actual idea, this actual word that sort of is associated with toxic masculinity, this term, is introduced in the 1980s. But it didn't really become a huge talking or discussion point until around 2010. And now I'm really grateful that it's getting more publicity. I'm really grateful that people are talking about toxic masculinity more and denormalizing it. I think that's a word. So I thought it would be good if we just talk about what the term means to each of us. So we can just go around in a little virtual circle and just talk about it.
I've been teaching for close to 30 years, and a thing that teaching for almost 3 decades has taught me is that there's nothing new under the sun. When Frankie Valli in the 1940s sang the song Walk Like a Man, Talk Like a Man, the same rules of masculinity apply and are used by today's young males. And what I realize is that there's an old school and there's a new school. The old school rules are still new school rules. However, when it comes to toxic masculinity and solving today's issues, we need some new tools. So we need to come from the new school. So you remember reading, writing, and arithmetic, those old school rules with education? I've
Yeah.
come up with what toxic masculinity means using some new school tools, an acronym that I came up with. I think of the U's, like the letter U. When I think of toxic masculinity, I think of masculinity that is unhealthy, masculinity that is unproductive, masculinity that is undermining
Right.
the individual and undermining the greater good. So these are some of the things I think about when I think about toxic masculinity. I also think of toxic masculinity as a one-sided or limited masculinity.
Can I jump in? I love that because when you said, there's nothing new under the sun, I think, because I've also been teaching for almost 3 decades, college students,
I
right?
rip this bump to
I,
you, boom.
that is not an easy thing to do. And it kind of stuns me every time I think about it. But I use that phrase a lot because usually there's a student who'll say, like in a creative writing class, or if we're writing narrative essays or personal essays, they'll say, like, nothing is new about my life. And then I'll say, oh, well, I know there's a saying, nothing's new under the sun, but the thing that is new is you,
Yes.
right?
Love
And you both know this. I mean, this is what we need. So I totally agree. When I was thinking about this question, I was thinking of like definitions like violence, dominance,
Right.
emotional illiteracy, entitlement, hostility to femininity, um, things that are in your sphere of influence. And I think growing up for me, it always meant like not quite fitting in,
Hmm.
like feeling on the outside of something when like I didn't want to say the joke that other people were saying. And I always got the sense that they didn't want to say it either, but it was like the thing that you had to say And then the other thing is like toxic masculinity is like the pressure you feel to do something and you can't quite get out of it. Or you like it's interesting. A lot of my college students will look back and say, "Why did I do that?" But when you're in that, you don't see a way out the way you do as you get older. And I think it can happen there as well. But I also just want to mention too, like, you know, words like man up, men don't cry, boys will be boys. Like these are phrases that toxify the air. And I think they have to be kind of front and center in any conversation
Hmm.
that we have about this. I know we're going to get into it, but I want to put
Yep.
them out there right away.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like toxic masculinity, it isn't just somebody else, like your parent or the people around you being toxic. I feel like it can also just sort of come from yourself. Like, the world has normalized you and put young men, put people into these sort of boxes, these rules that they have to fit. I mean, if you think about something like the Breakfast Club, you like they always say like, oh, you have the basket case, you have the jock, and I mean, toxic masculinity really puts people into these boxes and they feel like they have no escape. It's like a mime when they're sort of like miming it out, like stuck in the box. Like it just it's hard. And I mean, these days you were talking about new school forms of combating it. I mean, there are podcasts that are going around like I mean, this is a good podcast. Don't click off everybody. This is a good one. But there are podcasts that are really normalizing toxicity and they're just sort of trying to teach guys to be like alpha or something and not and only really care about yourself, which is pretty much just like I mean, for starters, it's awful. And it doesn't really make much sense because that's not really like an I mean, for starters, an alpha in a pack cares for the entire group of people. It cares for everybody. They're like the leader and they
Exactly.
help others. So for starters, like from a definition standpoint, absolutely wrong. And also from an emotional and from a social standpoint, it's just, I mean, every single aspect of it is wrong. And I don't really understand why people are really sort of feeling like they have to fit into these boxes because now in this sort of world we don't. And hopefully that people will start to see like I can be me and that's okay.
You
So
know, well, when you talk about that, what it makes me think about is I, I recently was invited to Washington, D.C. to
mm,
sit on a panel of Black and Latinx uh, influencers in the field. Uh, and some of them were authors like Chris and I. Some of them were educators and authors like Chris and I.
mm,
Some were involved in government. Some were involved in other things, and they had asked the question. They said, "What do young boys need in order to evolve into their best selves?" And one of the things that I said is, all young people need safe spaces
mhm,
to express and de-stress and feel supported in being their authentic selves. And that applies to boys because you brought up us being put in boxes and who does it. One of the things that makes Chris's books great, one of the things that I try to do with my books is that we write about the four major influences on young people's development. And in reality, these four influences, they influence all people. Like if you imagine that game show Wipeout, where someone's trying to walk across a plank and these big boulders are coming and swinging, these four things could knock a person off course. But if these four things are in place as supports, they could help a young person go from A to Z to their higher ground, in whatever domain that is. And the four major influences are media, friends,
mhm.
family, and school. So when we talk about who made these rules, who put us in these boxes of masculinity, those four major influences are always at work. Um, there's a scene that I would love to share with you. It's only a paragraph. Can I read something? Where the boy he he we brought up men and alphas are supposed to care for the pack. It's interesting you bring that up, E-Train, because there are good intentioned men who think they're being alpha, caring, and modeling. and in maintaining a toxic masculinity. And they don't realize the error of their ways until it's too late. And the ripple effect affects others. For example, there's the scene in Tight. And Tight revolves around this boy he's shy, he's an introvert, and he eventually learns how to use his voice. And he something happens, and he decides that he needs to handle it with fists in a very toxic way. And he's having a conversation with his mom, and the mom in the book is very much my mother. And the mom says, "So you see that you made choices, right? You chose not to talk to your friend first. And then you chose to explode on him." And then the boy responds, I was just handling it like a man. I was handling it like my dad. And as I say that, I feel like a parrot. I'm just echoing what I was taught by my father, what he showed me. And then the boy continues. He says, "Soft, Ma, that's not good. I can't be that." And Ma sits for a minute, not talking. She says, "Brian, I love your father, and there are a lot of things I love about him. But I don't love that he follows these rules about how to be a man. I don't love that he doesn't control his temper. And I don't like when he explodes and he chooses violence. That's not tough, and that's not smart." And then he says something that connects to what Chris said. And Chris said there are these words that come up when we think about toxic masculinity. And one of those words we just touched on was violence, but another word is respect. Brian responds and says, "I say, yeah, Ma, but I can't let people disrespect me. Just like Pa can't let people disrespect him." And I feel like respect is at the core of what perpetuates toxic masculinity.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is, a powerful paragraph, a powerful part of your story. And it just stands true. Like throughout history, it's all about respect in their eyes. And, I think we can all agree that toxic masculinity has been found in many cultures. It still can be found in many cultures around the world. And these ideas of, manning up or doing what a man should do, they've been passed down from generation to generation throughout history. And, boys, starting from a very young age, are always driven to be the strongest, the fastest, the loudest in the room, assert dominance over others. And that's just a few traits. So, can you share some common themes found in stories or real life that you believe demonstrate toxic masculinity and how we can sort of combat these and become better people and blossom into better people?
I love this question, and I'm still pretty moved, Tori, by what you said because it makes me think of. I'm just writing things down as as we're talking because it's given me even newer ideas. And
Oh, bro, Cupid shot an arrow in my heart because I hold you in high esteem, so
well,
that I could spark ideas in you, bro. That makes me feel great. Thank you.
likewise, I mean, I just think it's just a matter of like how we think about how we end up in these places, which is kind of your question is like, and I think so much of it is in life, like we make choices and it comes down to choices. And in books, often center around, to get mechanical, like plot points where the character has to make a choice, like the character in your book that you just talked about. Like there was a choice that had to be made, and they didn't do it in isolation. The isolation is what's really dangerous.
Mm,
And I often see that, like if you're forced to make a choice, the four things that Tori mentioned really play into who you are. And they often fight against like the internal like gauge inside of you that's pulling for justice, for joy, for love, for caring. And you trade it for a quick win, which can often be making fun of someone, making them like stepping down on them, putting them in their place so that you might feel better. so that I might feel better, so that this person maybe feel better. And that's often what we see when I'm thinking of stories in real life where I've seen, it's easy for someone to display dominance. Much harder, much more challenging, much more rewarding, of course, for someone to show care and empathy. You
Right.
mentioned like the 80s, like I was thinking how I was okay, I'm gonna be vulnerable to counter toxic masculinity here, to say that I was in a play in the 80s, um, and it was called, this is, it was called A Label is Something on a Can. This is not the best title that you've ever heard in your life. However, it was all about, like, there was the geek, the weirdo, kind of like Breakfast Club, like you talked about, and how each one tried to get up on the other one and who was stepped down on. But in the end, they were all kind of the same people. And so I think, we have these stories where we've been stepped on, or we've seen others stepped on, whether we stepped in or not. But it's that empathy that really unlocks, the truth of who we are and fights against these behaviors,
Right.
you know.
You well, you asked the question about like what books do we see toxic masculinity perpetuated in,
Mhm.
and I want to answer that question. Before I do, I just have to say something. We are in the right space, the three of us together, because when you said that you were in that play about labeling and that title, and you questioned that title, it connected to me when I was a teen. I have a picture, and yeah, I'll probably send it to you. So if you want to include it with the promotion of this wonderful discussion, it's a picture of teen me wearing a T-shirt, and the T-shirt says "Label jars, not people." And I'm laying on top of my mom, and who was someone who constantly pushed me to develop other sides of my masculinity. It was very important for her to have me be a multidimensional man, because she saw where being one-sided or limited led the other men in my family. That's one of the things that I need to amplify. I'm the only male survivor in my family. Um, Not too long ago, my uncle passed away, and when my uncle passed away, my niece, who I raised as my daughter, she's in her 30s now, and she's thriving. She asked me to do the eulogy for my uncle, and I said, I'm honored. I'd love to do the eulogy. How come you asked me? And she said, because uncle, you're the uncle now. And it hit me that I'm the uncle now. And, you know, there's a book that perpetuates toxic masculinity. It's actually well known. It's been in print for longer than the three of us have been alive, and it'll be in print for many more generations. It's actually not just one book. Uh, it's Christians' holy book, the Bible, and it's Jewish people's the Torah. And in it, there's a code that comes from Mesopotamia about an eye for an eye justice,
All right.
right? That if someone takes a man's eye, then the justice should be you should take that man's eye. And this is one of the reasons why in the book Hands to me really breaks down a lot of the rules of toxic masculinity. This is one of the reasons why someone joked that this is like Hamilton's The 10 Dual Commandments, because it goes into the laws of fighting. But there's a scene in here where the boy is sitting inside Miss Clark's class, and he says this. She starts her lesson with this corny Dr. King quote: "An eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind." You know, she asks the class, "Why do you think Dr. King said that?" And some kids raise their hands. Me, I stand my textbook up so she thinks I'm reading. And I wonder, how tall is this book? I rest my chin on my hand. Boom. I must have fallen asleep because next thing I know, class is empty and Miss Clark is talking to me. Fast forward, he says to her, I'm sorry, Miss Clark. Dr. King is cool, but he's not what I need for real life right now. And this circles back to what Chris said. In the moment, there's this immediacy of I can do this and I can feel this instant feeling of justice. But then when we ask ourselves, let's look at how things play out and think a few steps ahead, it turns out that an eye for an eye actually leaves the whole world blind, and violence perpetuates, or violence, which is another Judeo-Christian term. Violence begets violence.
And I wanted to continue just sort of like a follow-up for Torrey. So your main characters, they fight society's norms, but they're also young Black men, and that sadly leads to people being scared of them, whether they're toxic or not. So what extra lengths in real life do Black men have to go through to help people feel safe around them? And how can others and how can they themselves fight the stereotypes that they're hyper aggressive or threatening? And I want to kind of sort of keep up with this, what books tackle this. So do you see any books that are sort of like showing, besides your books, of course, that like Black men with soft hands and big hearts?
You asked a really good question. You asked the question. I'm Black. I'm Puerto Rican.
Mm-hmm.
I'm from Brooklyn. And one of the things that makes this conversation that we're having together so powerful is that we're all from different neighborhoods, right? Different parts of the United States. We're from different racial backgrounds, different economic backgrounds, different social backgrounds. And yet we feel this strong overlap. We feel this strong similarity around how we were conditioned as males. So it's super powerful that the three of us are having this conversation. You asked the question, what do Black men do to not be seen as the stereotype, to not be seen as aggressive, not to be seen as thugs? And I have to use a story shared by one of the most prominent Black men in entertainment today. If you turn on the TV and look at the Jimmy Fallon Late Show, he has a band, right? The legendary Roots Crew. And there's a drummer. His name is Questlove. He has this huge afro, like the afro that I used to have. And he has a pick in it usually. And he writes this a really amazing story about going into his building. And he says, and he goes into his building, he's rich. And there are not a lot of Black men in the building. And whenever he's in the elevator with a white woman, he shrinks.
Mm.
He tries to be as non-threatening as possible. He bottles in his authenticity. And instead of taking up space in a non-aggressive way, he minimizes himself to not take up space. And that's really about bottling in. What happens if we take a soda bottle, right, and we shake it up? Because he writes the story about being in this elevator, and he shook up because he's attracted to the woman, this white woman who gets on the elevator, but he doesn't want to be seen as a threat or overly aggressive. So all these bottled up feelings that he has, he just bottles them up. And we ask that question of what happens when we bottle up our emotions as Black men. It's the same thing that happens when we bottle up our emotions as any man from any background. And this is where I have to use the words of another Black man, Langston Hughes.
Mm.
Langston Hughes, he wrote a poem, and this is the poem. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or does it fester like a sore and then run? Does it sink like rotten meat? or crust over, sugary, syrupy sweet. Maybe a dream deferred just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? And I have to say, there are a number of things that I do as a Black man, as a Puerto Rican man, to not seem aggressive and not fulfill certain stereotypes. And I have to say that sometimes those things that I do can be extremely limiting and extremely hurtful and extremely silencing. And that energy has to go somewhere. So I'm really fortunate that I write, because I'm able to pour bit by bit the emotions onto the page. I'm really fortunate that I'm a teacher, because I get to interact with young people and with staff who embrace other parts of me and allow me to be more authentic and more unbottled. But I often wonder, what happens to guys like us who we don't have places to vent, and we don't have vessels to unbottle and pour our mixed emotions into. And I wonder about that.
We've talked a lot about representation and ideas portrayed about toxic masculinity in books. What about in movies and television as a whole? How has Hollywood depicted toxic masculinity, and is it trending in the right direction, in your opinions?
I mean, it's such a good question because I'm going to start at the heart, Torrey, with Marvel.
Yeah. Me and you, brothers from other mothers with Marvel.
But I thought right away of, I'm a long time comic book. So when we say like
Love it.
movies and TV, and I'm thinking of comics, but I'm just
Mm-hmm.
going to focus for a second because I know you've got Spider-Man, I've got Captain America,
Mm-hmm.
you know what I mean? And for me, I think about who I am in my own life as a dad with daughters, with a queer family, and what I look like. And then I have Filipino American wife and kids who are mixed, and it's just, so what is my role in this? And by the way, like the things I hear people say, not knowing who I am and where I come from, because they feel free to say things, and I just feel kind of moved to just say that because we see these things all around us, and I think there are a lot of good movies, TV characters that fight this.
Mm.
So I just say, like, I thought of right away of Captain America, because he is a guardian and not a warrior per se,
Mm-hmm.
right? As depicted in the comics through and through, and even in the movies as well. And I do martial arts, Krav Maga, which is not a peaceful martial art, right? That's really like a defend kind of martial art. And people often ask me, like, why, if are you violent? Like, why do you want to do that? And it's not that. It's that there is a positive masculinity out there, right? That's all about responsibility, right? We learn in bar mitzvah, we learn about responsibility, about caring, about the roles we play to be positive influences and impact. And I feel like for me, learning Krav Maga is one example of just learning to be that guardian. And I think characters like Captain America, um, I'm going to take 1 minute to talk about Lord of the Rings. I have to, and talk about Aragorn as a character who books I read over and over again, who's like this, very wise warrior who's probably one of the best in the known world at the time, but he is full of doubt and love for his friends and caring and about brotherhood. And these kinds of stories are so, so important. And there's a lot of places where you're going to find toxic stuff. But I thought I just have to zero in back to Marvel for a second, talk about these characters who really are guardians rather than warriors out to get theirs, you know?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to jump in real quick. So,
Yeah. Right.
like from a Captain America standpoint, I think one scene that really stands out, at least to me, I'm not really as much of a comic sort of person. I don't think I really read many of the comics about him. I read Alan Gratz's Captain America comic, but that's about it.
Yeah.
So I think one scene from the movie, like Captain America, just the first Avenger, the first movie, it's when they're all running, like all the people in the army, and there's a pole, they have to try and reach the flag, and everybody sort of jumps up and tries to climb up the pole to reach the flag, and they're all warriors. They're trying to jump in and just be the first, be the best. But then you see Captain America, you see Steve Rogers. He just sort of I can't necessarily remember, but I think he like bends the pole down or like he loosens the screws. And so he uses his wits and he uses his brain rather than using brawn and using
Yeah.
physicality and strength. And that really stood out to me. I think that Captain America, like you said, he's a guardian. He's not really a warrior. I mean, when he has to fight, he will, but
Right.
he defends the people that he loves versus charging in and trying to be the attacker rather the attacked.
You know, I love this question about what Hollywood is doing because as an educator, I see so many young people are like us. You know, they have the same conversations that I was having when I was their age. Who would win a fight? Would it be Superman versus the Hulk?
Yeah.
And these conversations that I hear young people having, what I try to do is I make sure that my art imitates life. So in Tight, there's a scene where the boys are going back and forth. Who would win? Daredevil versus Batman. Who would win? Hulk versus Colossus. So very much, I'm trying to take Hollywood icons, Hollywood characters, and then use it as a trampoline in my stories to jump off to what could exist that doesn't exist right now in Hollywood. When it comes to black men, when it comes to brown men, Hollywood thinks very binary.
Mm.
There's the intellectual, academic, very civilized black man, which is exemplified in T'Challa,
Right.
Chadwick Boseman, the Black Panther. Or it's the angry black man, which is personified in Killmonger. And those two tropes play through in so many different arenas. If you look at Rock, Mr. T, right? The angry black man. It's just, there's the Denzel Washington. He's usually the intellectual. And then you have another who's usually, and so what Hollywood could do is Hollywood could get away from talking about black men as two extremes, either the angry black man or the intellectual, and realize that there is a spectrum of black masculinity. There's a spectrum of masculinity, and then show that. A lot of times, the option is fight or not fight,
Hmm.
and Hollywood perpetuates that, which is one of the reasons why I really liked Black Panther, T'Challa, the first movie. He did not want to fight Killmonger. He did not want, he was trying desperately to find another way to resolve this. Even to the point that you remember when, and I'm giving a spoiler out, so if anybody hasn't seen Black Panther, I apologize.
Yeah.
There's a scene where T'Challa goes over to the ancestral plane where he meets his father and he confronts his father and he says, we abandoned him. We abandoned Killmonger. Like, this is our fault. Why didn't you take the mask off of toxic masculinity? And why didn't you tell me when I was a boy that this had happened? That I have a cousin who was abandoned. We could have done things. So I really love that scene. If I ever get in touch with Ryan Coogler or I ever have a conversation, I got to give him a dap. I got to give him a fist bump. I got to give him a hug. That he was trying to show a healthy masculinity, that violence doesn't always have to happen. Another thing that I do with my books is I want to echo the great launch of Chris. Chris said, I'm going to start by talking about Marvel. And I love that you said, let's start talking about Marvel, because I talk about Marvel characters in all of my books. I talk about DC characters in all of my books. In Tight, in my book Tight, there's a scene where the two boys, first become friends and they're looking at comics, and one boy turns to the main character and he says, out of all these superheroes, who do you want to be? The reason why I'm using superheroes is because a lot of times kids don't want to hear vocabulary words. They don't want to hear that the book is useful for social emotional learning. They don't want to hear words that are great words that Chris said earlier: dominance, violence, respect, right? Dimensionality. They don't want to hear that. They get turned off, right? But kids don't get turned off from what's fun. So one of the things that Chris does and I do is we hide these terms in stories that kids could relate to. So I hide a lot of the terms that relate to toxic masculinity or masculinity by stories. So you get the binary, you get the one or the other. And on page 19, if anybody has typed, where he says, which would you choose? There you go. You have a choice, right? And Ryan says, oh, I want to be, thanks, E. I see you showing tight. I want to be Black Panther, he says, or I want to be Batman, because they're smart. They think 10 steps ahead. And if they have to fight, then they will fight, but they're really smart. You realize that there's two choices being presented, and then the boy comes in and he offers a third option. And if you want to know what the third option is, you got to read the book. There's another superhero moment in Hands where I really applaud a movie that a lot of people don't like. One of my close friends, he can't believe that I've watched the movie twice because he thought the first, it took one viewing for him to be turned off. Black Adam. You remember Black Adam?
Oh, I love Black Adam, yeah.
I love Black Adam. Thank you, E. So in this book, right, what I tried to show is what the movie tried to show, that it's not about being strong like Superman or Shazam. There's a power in emotions. There's a power in vulnerability. There's a power in trying to choose another way. And there's a scene in here where the older sister comes into his room and she needs help because she helps run a community center. And she says, are you still drawing? And he goes, not really, but I have drawings. And she picks a drawing out of his shoebox of drawings. And she sees the Black Adam. And he thinks that she's going to focus on the muscles. But she traces Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's, the Black Adam's face. And she says, you're so good at showing emotions. And I put that in there to show what I hope Hollywood does. I hope Hollywood starts showing an emotional range of masculinity.
It's interesting, right? Because what you're saying is making me think, E, too, like that there's so much we could say about Hollywood. And we're just going to get to a little bit of Marvel. Like what you're saying makes me think of Ari and All of Me, right? Like he's a kid who's been teased and bullied about his weight his whole life. And he's trying to find a way to understand that. And then he collects comics and he's putting up a Spider-Man comic on his wall. And there's a chapter called Clothes Like Spider-Man. And he wishes that he could wear a tight shirt like Spider-Man wears. And he kind of uses this icon to think of himself and trying to imagine what he could be like and why can't he? And then, but in the end, he's like, at least Spider-Man gets to wear a mask. And he wishes kind of like he could wear a mask. But like, think of that iconography. Like we think about these Hollywood, these literary, these Marvel characters. They're like a common thread. It's just, so there is this question so important because these are the characters that provide that thread between us, between readers, and they just play such a big role in how we all understand each other. So my hope too would be that there'd be even more representation in Hollywood and more in literature.
Yeah, and oh yeah, I just wanted to say from like continuing with sort of Marvel, I guess. If you're talking about Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, but I mean specifically Across the Spider-Verse. Yeah, I see that smile, Torrey.
You know it.
I mean, I love the movies, but one thing that that really stood out to me, I mean, if you go into the multiverse of all the spider people, I mean, you see that all the Spider-Men or Spider people, however you want to say it, their parent, they all have, police officer parents. And
Mm.
you see that, I mean, I mean, I'm forgetting a lot of the people's names. It's been a while, so I think I have to rewatch it after this interview. But anyway, their parents are all trying to get them, all think that the Spider-Man, Spider people are evil. But then you look at Miles Morales and his relationship with his dad, and his dad is different, and his relationship is different. Maybe it's because Miles Morales is sort of an anomaly. I mean, you have to watch the movie. It's been out for a couple years. It's not really a spoiler. If you're calling it a spoiler after like 2 years, then I'm not gonna listen. But anyway, so Miles Morales, he has a different relationship, and he loves his dad. His dad loves him, and even if his dad doesn't know that he's Spider-Man, I think that, and maybe he could eventually tell him in the third movie, which I hope will come out. But I know the writers and the animators. Okay, I'm getting into a whole tangent, but
Oh,
I
it's
just wanted
good.
to say, yeah, like,
I like it.
um, I think that,
Same.
yeah, Miles Morales really fights the mold, and he and his dad have a really profound relationship, even if they get into fights, even if they get into skirmishes, especially after the party and across the Spider-Verse that he sort of like dipped out on. But you know, they love each other. And that love, that respect, even if they don't know, even if he doesn't know that he's Spider-Man, his dad doesn't know that he's Spider-Man, he sort of like has that sense like, this guy is doing good. And
Mhm.
I respect that.
Yeah.
It's
The reason I smile is because y'all both know how much I love superheroes, and Chris and I, we came up the same way. We love comics.
yeah.
Um, we could have a whole other podcast between Chris, you, and myself about how comics are super important to literacy development, and but that's a whole other conversation. One of the reasons that I smiled is because everything that we're talking about, I tried to put in this scene. There's a scene in What Lane? I wrote What Lane. It feels as though we've all heard this term, stay in your lane, right? Um, what does that mean? Like, stay in your lane. What lane? And that's why the topic is what lane? Like, what lane are you supposed to stay in? And there's a scene in there where I was very intentional in showing how scared the boy was to climb, but also how the boy couldn't get any higher unless he had an E-train, unless he had another boy who was helping him reach up. And this is one of the reasons why, I feel you are superheroic. You're an everyday superhero because of the work that you do to reach down to younger grades and help lift younger people up to higher grounds and higher heights of humanity, empathy, of compassion, of wise action. So, I just want to applaud you. There's a scene here where the boy, he's dared to climb this fence that some of his friends are up, and he starts to do it. And I won't go into it with the specifics, but you when you read it, you're like, this kid is terrified, and his friends see it. That's very important. Us taking our mask, our armor off, and letting other people see the real us, and then giving them an opportunity to help. And there's a boy shaking the fence as he's climbing, trying to make him fall.
Yeah.
And Christopher reaches out to me from top. Stefan, give me your hand. I'll pull you up. And I grip my fingers into the fence holes, and I'm trying to pull myself up as hard as I can. And Chris, his hand is so close. Stefan, come on, just a little more, just a little. And right then, smack, our hands clasp. And with me climbing and him pulling up, I finally make it to the top. And when I get there, I dangle 1 foot over, and Chris says, Dan, didn't you call him Miles Morales? And then hugs me. And I do feel like Miles Morales.
Your books don't necessarily say toxic masculinity in them, but they do sort of mention the ideas of toxicity in households, in families, in friendships. And I think normalizing healthy parents and child relationships, healthy masculinity, it is just as important as tackling the problems of toxic masculinity. It's like a tongue twister every time I try and say it. But
Mhm.
you know, it's just as important to talk about the good in family dynamics, as to talk about the bad. Because when you normalize um, healthy relationships, that's just as important. And can you share how your books discuss this concept of positive masculinity?
Yeah, I mean, I love this because I think all the books I've written and the books I'm writing now are deal squarely in intergenerational relationships
Mm,
and all the difficult ways that they exist because you often have, like in the magical and perfect, I often say it's like the magic of the ancient world clashes, with the
right,
reality of the modern world. And is there any relevance to that? And that's really what the grandfather's asking. You know, it is creating a golem going to make a difference? Is the healing clay from an ancient river going to do anything to a modern wound? Right. And
right,
that's where these kind of intergenerational family contexts come into play. And we talk about, toxic masculinity, and it's a lot about cultural norms that we're breaking, um, generational norms. Often things come with a whole schema, right? A whole context that comes alive and changes the way we see things. But it's and this is my one of the things I love most about books is that you have time and space to get through all of it, like to see the difficult things, the context, the characters growing and learning. I know Aton, magical and perfect. I mean, he has selective mutism. He can't speak really for himself, right?
right,
And so he becomes a misfit, an outcast from his friends. They kind of make fun of him, until he finds maybe a deep friendship in Malia, who has her own family sort of stuff going on, and together they start to appreciate their family and understand how their family loves them. And Aton, in particular, his dad is more of a blue collar worker, doesn't totally understand the emotional part, or doesn't dwell in that. Maybe he's more of a victim of toxic masculinity. Um, in The Gray, Sasha deals with this too with his father, who tells him all the time to be tough, but he's got his Aunt Ruthie who really just demystifies and turns the whole idea of what tough is like on its head. And she teaches him what's up, like how to be tough, how to be loving, how to care for the people that you're even afraid of. And I think too in my next book, Spark, coming out, and Finn and Rabbit deal with this too. They're dealing with long lines of family members deeply affected by circumstances beyond their control that
right.
lead to sort of these toxic behaviors. And I think books provide ways to see the whole family in the wide view and in the long run, to see how they get through these difficult times and yet still love each other, because that's real, right? Like we're not all perfect, we're all learning, we're all community together. And I just love that books provide that time and space.
hmm
Percent
The,
agree.
the, I love everything that you said. The and I want to take a page out of what um, Chris was laying down and apply it to my books. Chris was talking about how the theme of toxic masculinity, it's a thread that runs through all of his books. Similarly, the theme of toxic masculinity is a thread that runs through all of my books. I'm very purposeful in not being authoritative or authorial when I write my books. I don't want my books to be boring. I try to write roller coaster fiction. I try to write short narratives that feel like a roller coaster. When a young person gets done with a chapter, they want to read the next chapter, or they want to go back and look at that chapter. When they're done with my book, they want to get back and read it again. And I get a lot of that. Right now, Hands is the global read aloud. And I'm getting a lot of emails from young people who are saying, I read this book twice. I read this book 3 times. Do you have anything else that's like, or could you recommend something else that's like it? And that makes me really happy because I've come up with this motto. I created this motto. No one quits what's fun. If it's boring, you want to quit it. If it's fun, you don't want to quit it. And so when you're writing books like Chris and you're writing books like myself, and we're writing books that are fun, young people are getting this entertainment, but they're also getting an education. I guess it's edutainment. They're getting these lessons, and then at the end they realize, and they're like, wait, I learned about this, and this is a valuable tool that's helped me navigate that. So I have to say, I want to take the idea of family and expand it a bit, because when we talk about family, we think about blood relatives, and it takes a village to raise a child. It took a village to raise me, and a lot of my family members were not blood related. This is why in Hands, the uncles are pivotal. He has a bunch of uncles in the neighborhood who are not blood related to him, but he says they love me more than some of my family members love me. And there's a scene in Hands where there's an uncle named Larry, and he's the librarian in the neighborhood. And Uncle Larry is showing Trev, the main character, Star Wars. And Trev is kind of freaking out because the fight scene between Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker reminds him of him. And Uncle Larry cues into that and questions him and asks him who he thinks he is. Does he think he's a Jedi? Does he think he's a Luke? Or is he a Sith? Does he identify with the dark side? And of course, so many of us identify with what Chris had mentioned. We identify with being a guardian, when actually we might be something else. And he says it to him here. He keeps on. And Uncle Larry says, solving things with anger, that's the Darth Vader way. And it doesn't take the pain away. It's not going to take you to a good place. And this is a pivotal scene because the boy starts to realize, he's like, wait a minute. All this time I was following these steps and thinking it was going to lead me to a different result. A great man came up with a quote, Albert Einstein. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And it's really important that Chris and I are putting caregivers into the books who are encouraging young people to do something different, to take different steps, to get different outcomes. I won't talk about too many of my other books, so I'll just talk about one. What Lane? What Lane? My mom, when my first book came out, she used to say, Ofri needs to know about you. Who she meant was Oprah. My mom was hilarious because she would take certain words and make them sound. One time she went to the sauna and she called me up and she said, I went to the Sunni. It felt so good. I was like, so she did this with her words. And she said, Ofri needs to know about you. Well, 3 books later, Oprah, she picked What Lane as one of her favorite books to teach what true friendship is about and what allyship is about. And in it, there's a dad and son scene that really models healthy parenting. And it really models how to promote healthy masculinity. It's a scene where the boy, he encounters racism for the first time. And he walks into his house and his dad spots. And he says it. He says, my dad, it's like he has spider sense. And he senses what's wrong with me as soon as he sees me. And so the dad has this conversation with him. And it's so important. I encourage people to read it. The boy asks, he tells him, he says, this is what just happened to me. Has anything like this ever happened to you? I got to tell both of you, when racism was happening to me as a young tween, and I went and talked to certain blood relatives, they told me really bad advice. Ignore it. It'll go away. These types of things.
Yeah.
So in this book, this dad does something different. He tells him, racism? You just tell me what you want to hear. You want to hear about racism I experienced when I was a tween, when I was a teen, or just the other day as a school teacher in the building that I work in. And the boy is completely shocked. His paradigm, his model of his dad is completely blown apart. And I think that's what we have to do. In order to build, sometimes we have to destroy. In order to build a new, healthy masculinity, we have to destroy old paradigms of masculinity. In order to share at a level that we've never shared before, we have to share in a different way. So in a lot of my books, the adults are sharing in a way that I wish adults would have shared with me, and that I find young people are saying are refreshing.
That's so important because I think that's another, it makes me think, Tori, what you're saying, that kids, we talk a lot about hoping that young readers and readers of all ages will see themselves in our books, right? That's the author's heart. Like, I want to write books that I would want to have read or help to see myself, but also for those generations, like the aunties and uncles, the grandparents, the rabbis. Like, I know in all of me, there's a rabbi who's like a mentor that Ari needs, that he didn't know he needed. And I think it's important for readers to see that those relationships are important, to listen to those people who are speaking into your life. That's reflected in books, and that is another kind of antidote to toxic masculinity, because it provides those reflections for people to see, oh, okay, this might be valuable. I should listen to the people in my life who love me and care about me. You don't always take the advice, but listening,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, it's like the breakdown of the acronym of team. Together, everyone achieves more, right? And so there's an African proverb, but if you want to go, go alone. But if you want to go your furthest, go with others. And a lot of times there are elders in our books who can help young people go further in their journey.
I want to sort of ask a question that is really important to me because, we've talked a lot about your books, but I think it's just as important to talk about other stories that really sort of fit the bill when it comes to combating toxic masculinity and combating these toxic traits that have been pushed and forced into the minds of young men. What are some healthy masculine storylines you'd like to see more of in middle grade books? Some ways that we can combat this hate, combat toxicity, and just overall help our young men, help young boys, help just boys and guys and men, everybody. Help us realize like that we don't have to be what everybody says that we have to be.
I would love to share. Usually, when people ask me for the names of a title, I compare it to currency and money. I say,
Mm.
would you rather have $1 or would you rather me open up the vault to a bank and you could walk in and you could take whatever you want? I know me. I want the vault. Let me walk in there and pick whatever I want, because then you can get much more than $1. So instead of mentioning specific titles, I'm going to mention names of authors who I feel do this across all of their books. If you want an author who is doing work to show a spectrum of manhood and boyhood, you got to check out the work of Jerry Craft.
Yes,
Also,
yes.
Don Tate, amazing illustrator. Eric Velasquez, Gordon C. James, Nikki Grimes, Renee Watson. Whenever I do this, I feel a little scared, because some of my friends are going to say, "Why didn't you mention me?" There are so many more people to name, but those are a few just to get us started.
I want to add some because I love the idea of the vault. I want a vault. I love that. I always learn so much from you guys. Like, I always think, oh, I have to make a list and I don't want to leave people out. But I like you, I don't even know where to start sometimes. There is a rich, vault full of great authors. So I'll add Carlos Hernandez, that's Sal and Gabby Break the Universe.
Yes.
Mike Jung, great. Boys in the Back Row. Um, I think Barbara D does a lot of this work, right?
Absolutely.
Just master classes in dealing with topics. Maybe he just likes you. Ernesto Cisneros books.
Yeah.
Love those books. Paula Chase. And who else do I have that you didn't say? I have a lot of the same ones. Lamar Giles, good stuff. And then I just want to shout out to a couple of originals, which is like, there were these are the books that are fighting all along, right? Like you've got Winnie the Pooh, any book with Christopher Robin, that sensitive Living in the 100-Acre Wood, Calvin and Hobbes, The Story of Ferdinand.
Yeah.
That's a front and center book for me. Frog and Toad, and so many others, right? Like that instill these kind of sense of joy and goodness and getting to the heart. So those books that get to the heart of who we are as people, not so much man, not so much woman, but people. Love those books.
Can I add another name to the list? Two other names to the list. I feel what these two authors are doing helps to show the range of a person, be it woman, girl, man, or boy. Meg Medina, our national ambassador for young people's literature. Everybody, please check out Meg Medina's work. A person who I would love if her books got more attention because they are absolutely amazing. Adriana Cuevas. She's doing some phenomenal, important work.
Totally agree.
Masculinity.
Yes.
In her books. And her books are just so fun.
I was going to say my youngest loves those books.
Yes.
When she writes, yeah.
Yep. I want to circle back to what you mentioned with Winnie the Pooh, Chris. The reason is it kind of puts everything that we're talking about into perspective. It really showcases what you're doing with this conversation and what you do with your work with literacy and young people. There's a moment in one of the Pooh books where Pooh is walking with Piglet in the woods, and Piglet turns to Pooh and says, "How do you spell love?" And Pooh says, "You don't spell love, you show it." So I want to thank you,
That's awesome,
for showing so much love around such important topics regarding young people.